Okay, so I'm sure some of you have gotten some pretty interesting pieces of advice from maybe the older generation, more specifically your parents. I know I've gotten ones like, why don't you just walk into a business and give them your resume? That's how you get a job.
You're like, Dad, that's not really how it works
Yeah,
nowadays.
that's
Everything's
just,
all online.
yeah,
Or, hey, I bought a house at 23. Yeah, but wasn't the house like 50,000 and now it's
yeah,
500,000?
yeah, add an extra zero on that. I mean, it just doesn't really work. Or just throw your money into a savings account and save your money. Inflation's far outpacing any savings account you're getting.
And so in today's video, we're talking about what we've heard our parents say and what we've heard the older generation say in general. Going through some examples, going through the numbers, and seeing why they don't work in today's market.
Stop wasting money on that dumb shit and instead put it in investment. I know it's tempting. You'll spend it and be broke again.
So welcome back to the channel, guys. I'm your bro Ryan.
And I'm your bro Taylor.
And starting off with our first example, just put your money in a savings account. So a lot of times you've heard saving accounts are safe, they're guaranteed. I don't trust the stock market, it's too risky. Around the 1980s, this could have made sense. Savings accounts were paying 8 to 10 to 12% interest sometimes. CDs were paying 10 to 15 plus percent in the early 80s. The stock market was way more volatile and way less accessible at this time. Inflation was super high at 10 to 15%.
Now, as you can already guess, the numbers are way different today, so let's get into those. The current average savings account is around 0.39%. You can get a little bit more with high yield savings account being around 3 to 5%, and the current inflationary rate is around 3% annually. Of course, there's been a bit of fluctuation in the last few years alone. So you're losing 2 to 3% of your purchasing power every year in just a normal savings account. Say you have $10,000 in a regular savings account, that's losing over $250 a year in buying power. And more specifically, $10,000 in a 0.39 savings account for 30 years gets you $11,250 total. Meanwhile, if you put that in the S&P 500 index fund for 30 years, which is averaging an annual return around 9%, you'd have $132,700. I don't really need to do the math, although it'll be on screen, of exactly how big of a difference that is.
Yeah, that's over $120,000 different. And that's not a little clip of the S&P we're taking. That's the average return of the S&P over the last 30 years. If you take certain segments, it's often 10, or I think last year was over 20% return. So if you just stay in the stock market, especially tracking the S&P, the odds are it's going to go up much, much more than 0.39%.
Yeah.
Like much more. So what are some better approaches than this? It kind of depends on honestly your savings goal. So if you're going to need your money in the next 3 to 6 months to maybe a year, you're probably just going to want to put your money in a high yield savings account, earning that 3 to 5%, making sure you're not losing much to inflation, if anything at all, maybe even gaining a few dollars here. If you're looking at a 1 to 2 year range, maybe you can park it in a CD because you don't need that money right now. You don't need it super liquid, but you'll need it soon in the future. If you need it a longer term goal, so you don't need it for 5, 10 years, you just want it to do its thing, then you're going to want to park it in probably a low cost index fund. We don't want a lot of fees to eat up our money in the future we want to access. If you're talking retirement and you're like 30, so you don't need it for 30 plus years, then you're probably going to want to max out your 401k, put as much into your Roth IRA as you can, max that out, and just dollar cost average to reduce that risk over time. Now, this video is not about bashing your parents by any means. The approach they went with was right in their time, and sometimes it's right in our time.
Yeah.
It just depends on the situation.
Running right into another piece of advice you maybe have heard before is just pay off your house. They make it sound so simple. But is that really feasible or make the most sense nowadays? Because, mortgage rates in the 80s were around 10 to 18%. Some even hit 21%, so obviously very high. And then paying off that 15% that you're maybe getting charged on your mortgage is like essentially a guaranteed return, and it's hard to beat that. Meanwhile, current mortgage rates are around 6 to 7%, and the stock market, like we said earlier, is averaging around 9%. So our investment is capable of outpacing that mortgage rate. So, is it really the best option? We could make an argument for either, but again, you just want to make the most informed decision you possibly can.
So let's say you bought a $400,000 house at a 6% mortgage, 30-year fixed. Then you put an extra $500 per month towards that mortgage. In the end, that'll save you $165,000 in interest over the life of the loan. That's pretty incredible. However, instead, let's say we got that same house, and instead of taking that extra $500 to pay that mortgage down faster, we invested. And let's say also that we didn't even get the average S&P returns of 9%. Instead, we were a little conservative. We only got 8% returns. We're looking at approximately $710,000. A $500,000 difference, and it could be more. Like we said, over the last 30 years, the S&P's returned about 9%. We took it a little bit more conservative, 8%. So we're looking like this is a huge difference. I'd rather $500,000. Not about you.
Yeah.
Actually, over $500,000, 700,000, but $500,000 in difference.
Now, of course, there are instances where your parents' advice maybe is the route you should go. I mean, let's say your mortgage rate is above 8%, which is rare nowadays, but, possible. So now you kind of have to figure in, okay, is my investment going to outpace that? It's a little bit closer right there, so the opportunity cost isn't quite as big. Of course, on top of that, if you can't really discipline yourself and you're like, oh my gosh, my stock dropped a couple percentage points, let me sell everything, then of course, all these numbers that we just gave in the example are meaningless. So you have to be disciplined.
So rolling into our next piece of advice that we've heard is credit cards are evil or debt is bad.
You've probably heard that from one guy in particular.
We're not going to name any names.
Dave Ramsey.
So back then in the 1980s to 1990s, credit card rates were about 18 to 24%. There was much less consumer protection against fraud. Predatory marketing tactics were very common. There was limited online account management and tracking like there is today. And there's just overall less education and responsibility around usage.
But at the same time, why this advice would hurt today is things like you're missing out on those 1 to 5% cash backs that a lot of cards are offering today. The credit card market is so competitive. Different companies are constantly trying to outdo each other with these cards. And nowadays, there's way less fraud protection with debit cards or using cash. Credit cards are now insured and everything, so it's a bit of a safer route. Plus, it's one of the most common ways to build a credit history and subsequent credit score, which of course is super necessary in today's time for just about anything, anytime you want to get a loan of any kind. And of course, we've touched on it in other videos, so we won't go into too much detail, but just having good credit habits can kind of negate the looming threat of credit cards. If you're paying it off on time, you're keeping your utilization good, then you're just getting those cashback rewards and there's really not too much to worry about. But it does take discipline. And I know I've heard a lot of people say this before, so I'm imagining you have too, but, oh, don't rent. That's just throwing money away. Just buy a house as soon as you can. It always sounds so simple. But if you actually get into the numbers, back in the day, house prices were 2 to 3 times the median annual income, and that minimum down payment you needed of 5 to 10% was much more doable because of lower costs. There was less competition from investments and foreign buyers, and back then there was actually lower transaction costs and a simpler buying process, which just made it a bit more of a stress-free process. And to their credit, the rent versus buy math favored buying much more back then.
Now, why is it much more complicated today and not as easy as that advice sounds? First, home prices are closer to 6 to 8 times the median income in many areas. And using that minimum 5% on today's housing prices of a median home of $400,000 is still $20,000 cash. Closing costs, maintenance, property taxes add up super quick, especially because a lot of them are multiples of the value of the home, which again is much higher. Transaction costs make short-term ownership expensive. So when does renting make more sense? You're planning to move within 5 years because of your career, life, yada yada, that it might not make sense to take all those costs up front just to sell and have more cost. You really didn't build up much equity in that time. Home prices are extremely high in your relative local market. If you don't have an emergency fund built up and a 20% down payment, it might not be the best move for you. You might be putting yourself at high risk. And if you're not very handy or you just don't want to deal with maintenance, repairs, property taxes, planning, anything like that, again, it might not be for you.
Now, of course, on the flip side of that, if you know you are going to be staying in an area for a while, then by all means, you maybe want to consider buying a house. It's an investment you're making towards your future. And if you do have a lot of savings to where you can maybe put down a full 20% to avoid PMI, that's awesome. You're cutting out a lot of those fees that we've been talking about. And really, you just kind of got to factor in the whole opportunity cost, the total cost of home ownership, because it's more than just your mortgage and taxes and insurance and everything. In fact, if we were to go into an example, in 1985, the median house was around $84,000, while the median income was around $35,000. Of course, in 2025, we're sitting around $420,000 for the median home. And of course, the median income has not increased at that same rate. It's still sitting around $70,000. So the same house that was built back then that you tried to buy in 1985 is now 2.5 times harder to afford today.
But going to our fifth and final is you're too young to invest. Worry about the future when it comes, or live your life now. You've heard all of those kind of things. Live while you can. Tomorrow's not promised kind of thing. Stock investing required expensive brokers with high minimums. Crazy high transaction fees made small investing near impossible. There was less education and less access to the market. There was way more emphasis on company pensions.
Now, on the flip side, the market is very different today. Of course, if you've seen some of our other videos, you've heard us harp on this concept before, is compound interest, where time is the biggest variable. It's the most valuable key to your investments growing over time, because that exponential growth. So getting in early is super important. On top of that, investing has become so readily available and accessible to us. I mean, apps like Robinhood, Acorns, Webull, all these things, it's just an app on your phone nowadays.
But let's look into an example with actual numbers to show it. So let's say person A invests $200 per month from age 22 to 32. They would have $24,000 invested. Then they stop. They just don't invest anymore until retirement. Then we have person B that invests $300 from age 32 to 62. They're investing more for triple the amount of time. They have $108,000 invested. So at a 9% return, person A at the age of 62 has about $510,000 in retirement, while person B at the age of 62 has about $510,000 in retirement.
Now, of course, we still want to be smart about investing. You want to have a bit of an emergency fund set up beforehand, and that's not something that you actually invest.
True.
Then you want to look if your company offers a 401k and if they offer any kind of match, because that's essentially free money. We're all about that free money. In addition to that, you can always go into an individual retirement account or IRA, Roth, or just normal, depending on what works best for you. Like for me, for example, I used a Roth IRA and maxed that out. If you're at that point, of course, you can go investing beyond that into a personal brokerage. And of course, we've touched on it a little bit before, don't panic when there's volatility.
Such a big
If you
one.
sell everything, you don't get any of those gains in the future. It's not like you're going to suddenly be like, oh, we're back here. My snowball's at this. You've lost it. So again, we'd love to hear from you down in the comments if you have any other piece of advice you've heard, like, oh, this is crazy, or maybe this is a great piece of advice. We, of course, love those. Everyone else would really appreciate it as well. So we appreciate you guys tuning in this week. Again, we'd love to interact with you down in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and tune in for next week.
Stop wasting money on that dumb shit and instead put it in investment. I know it's tempting. You'll spend it and be broke again.